My wife. Richard Carter lifted his glass and smiled at the table. She's what happens when you stop trying. The laughter came quickly, light, comfortable, practiced, the kind that fills a dining room where everyone believes they understand the story already. Evelyn Carter didn't react. She sat at the far end of the polished oak table, her hands resting loosely beside her plate, posture straight, expression calm. The chandelier above cast a warm yellow glow across crystal glasses and silverware, catching the edge of her ring as she adjusted it once, almost absently. Around her the conversation kept moving, but the tone had shifted just enough. One of Richard's friends leaned forward, smirking slightly, curiosity dressed as humor. So what does Evelyn actually do all day? He asked. Richard didn't hesitate. He shrugged, took a slow sip of his bourbon and said, "Nothing you'd call impressive." This time the laughter was louder, less polite. Someone tapped their glass. Another shook their head like it was all harmless. Evelyn's eyes moved across the table, not searching for support, not asking for anything, just observing. She noted who laughed first, who avoided looking at her, who seemed a little too comfortable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She let the moment sit exactly as it was. Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over it, relaxed, confident, unaware of the precision in her stillness. The air smelled faintly of grilled steak and expensive cologne, the kind that lingers just long enough to feel intentional. Outside, through the wide glass windows, the night was quiet, suburban streets lined with parked cars and trimmed hedges, nothing out of place. Inside, everything was. Another guest raised a glass. "Hey, you're lucky, Richard. Not everyone gets a life that easy." Richard smiled again, wider this time. "I know," he said. "I've been carrying everything for years." He turned slightly, just enough to include Evelyn in the statement without really looking at her. "Right." The question hung in the air, but it wasn't really a question. It was a performance. All eyes shifted to her. Evelyn met his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded, small, controlled. "Of course," she said quietly. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It settled into the space between them like something finished, not something broken. A few people glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh again or move on. Someone reached for their drink. Someone else checked their phone. The moment stretched, then softened, but it didn't disappear. It stayed in the room just beneath the surface. At the far end of the table, a man who hadn't spoken all evening watched her closely. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't smiled. His fingers rested lightly against the stem of his glass, untouched. Evelyn noticed him without turning her head. Just a shift in focus. Just enough. Richard didn't notice any of it. He was already moving on, already telling another story, already comfortable again. He thought the moment had passed. He thought he had defined it. He didn't know the room had already begun to change. And he definitely didn't notice the exact second the front door quietly unlocked. The soft click of the lock was almost polite, the kind of sound most people would miss if they were not already paying attention, but Evelyn noticed it immediately, not with her ears, but with the way the room shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like air pressure changing before a storm, and for the first time that evening, her gaze moved away from Richard and toward the entryway across the open living room where the hallway light cast a narrow strip of brightness across the hardwood floor. No one else turned yet, not fully, just a few distracted glances, the kind people make when they think someone might be arriving late but not important enough to interrupt the flow of conversation. Richard kept talking, his voice steady, confident, filling the space again as if nothing had happened. "You know how it is," he said, chuckling. "Some people just are not built for pressure." And a couple of his friends nodded, one of them swirling the ice in his glass, another leaning back with a smirk that had not quite faded. But the man at the end of the table, the one who had not laughed, he looked directly at the door now, his expression tightening just slightly, not fear, not surprise, recognition. Evelyn saw that too. She did not turn her head fully, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass cabinet beside her. A figure stepping inside, measured, unhurried, the door closing quietly behind him. The kind of entrance that did not ask for attention but took it anyway, polished. Shoes on wood, steady, controlled, each step deliberate, and still no one spoke about it, not yet, because the conversation at the table had not fully died. It was still fading like music lowering before a new track begins. Richard lifted his glass again, about to continue. about to reinforce the version of the story he had been telling all night, the one where he was the center, the provider, the one in control. But then someone near the middle of the table hesitated, their eyes drifting past him, focus breaking. Another followed, and then another. The laughter stopped completely this time, not because of anything Richard said, but because of what was happening behind him. Evelyn remained still, her hands exactly where they had been, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. But there was something different now, something settled, like a decision that had already been made long before this night, long before this table, long before any of them had taken their seats. The footsteps came closer, crossing the living room, entering the edge of the dining area, and finally, someone cleared their throat softly, an unconscious signal that the moment had shifted. Richard noticed it then, just a flicker, just enough to pause mid-sentence, his smile holding for a second too long before he turned slightly in his chair, not fully, just enough to glance over his shoulder, expecting interruption, not expecting consequence. And in that brief second, before he fully understood, before anyone spoke, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest movement of her eyes toward the doorway, meeting the gaze of the man who had just entered, a silent acknowledgement, precise, controlled and final. And that was the moment the balance in the room changed, even if no one could name it yet, even if Richard still believed he was in control, because he did not see what Evelyn saw. He did not understand what had just walked into his house, and more importantly, he did not realize that every word he had said tonight had already been heard by the only person who mattered. Richard turned fully this time, slower than he should have, as if his body needed a second longer than usual to process what his eyes were seeing. The smile on his face still there but no longer supported by anything real. It lingered out of habit, not confidence, and for a brief moment, he said nothing, which was unusual for him. The man standing at the edge of the dining room did not speak either. He simply stopped a few feet from the table, posture straight, hands relaxed at his sides, his presence quiet but undeniable, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. A tailored dark suit, clean lines, nothing flashy, but precise in a way that suggested intention, not style. His gaze moved once across the table, not lingering on anyone, not reacting to the half-finished glasses, the plates, the people who now sat slightly straighter in their chairs, and then it settled on Evelyn, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition, like someone confirming a detail that had already been verified. The silence stretched. No one laughed now, no one reached for a drink, even the small background sounds seemed to fade. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a wall clock, everything pulled back just enough to make the room feel sharper. Richard cleared his throat lightly, a reflex more than a decision. "Can I help you?" he asked, the question coming out controlled but thinner than his voice had been just seconds earlier. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he took one step closer, just enough to close the distance without invading it, and then he spoke, his tone calm, even professional. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the table without needing to rise. "I was told Miss Evelyn Carter would be here." The name landed differently than anything else that had been said that night, not because of the words, but because of the way they were delivered, precise, intentional, without hesitation. Several heads turned toward Evelyn again, but this time not with amusement, not with expectation. Something else had replaced it, something quieter, more cautious. Richard frowned slightly, the confusion settling in now. "She is?" he said, gesturing vaguely in her direction as if the answer should resolve the situation. "What is this about?" The man shifted his attention to Richard for the first time, not dismissive, not confrontational, just neutral. "I am here to speak with her directly," he said, and then his gaze returned to Evelyn, steady, unwavering. Evelyn did not rush to respond. She did not look surprised. She did not ask questions. She simply placed her napkin neatly beside her plate and rose from her chair, the movement smooth, unhurried, the kind of movement that suggested control rather than reaction. The sound of the chair sliding back was soft, but in the silence it carried. Richard watched her, something tightening behind his expression now, something he had not prepared for. "Evelyn," he said, her name no longer casual, no longer part of a performance. She turned slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his voice. "It is fine," she said, quietly, her tone the same as before, calm, measured, but now there was something else underneath it, something that had not been there earlier, something settled, final. She stepped away from the table, closing the space between herself and the man who had entered, and for a brief second, they stood facing each other, Not like strangers, not like acquaintances, but like two people who already understood the context of this meeting without needing to explain it. The man inclined his head slightly, a small gesture of respect, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim folder, dark structured. He did not open it yet. He simply held it, waiting not for permission but for the moment, and behind them, the table remained completely still. No one spoke, no one moved, because whatever this was, it was no longer part of Richard's story, and somewhere in that realization, something began to shift in the way they all looked at Evelyn, not fully, not yet, but enough to make the room feel different, enough to make it clear that whatever came next was not going to follow the script Richard had been so certain of. And he felt that too, even if he could not explain it, even if he did not yet understand why. The folder remained in the man's hand for a second longer than expected, not because he hesitated, but because he was allowing the moment to settle, allowing the room to understand that whatever was inside it mattered. Evelyn's eyes moved briefly to the edge of the folder, then back to his face, a silent signal. He understood it immediately. He opened it without rushing, the soft sound of paper shifting cutting cleanly through the silence. And then he spoke again, still calm, still measured. "There are a few documents that require your review and confirmation," he said, his tone the same one someone would use in a boardroom, not in a private dining room filled with half-finished conversations and people who suddenly did not know where to look. Richard stood up then, the chair scraping slightly against the floor. Not loud, but sharp enough to break whatever fragile control he thought he still had. "Hold on," he said, his voice firmer now, stepping forward just enough to reinsert himself into the space between them. "You cannot just walk in here and start handing my wife paperwork without explaining what this is." The word "my" landed heavier than the others, as if ownership could still define the situation. The man did not react to the tone, did not match it, did not challenge it. He simply shifted his gaze to Richard again, steady, neutral. "Of course," he said. "This concerns a series of executive decisions finalized earlier this week." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. "Decisions that list Miss Carter as the primary authority." The words were simple, but they did not belong in this room, not in this context, not in the version of reality Richard had been presenting all evening. A few people at the table exchanged quick glances, confusion rising quietly. Richard frowned, a short, disbelieving breath leaving his nose. "Primary authority of what?" he asked, the question sharper now, the edge of irritation replacing confidence. Evelyn did not answer for the man. She did not step in to soften anything. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, watching. The man turned one page inside the folder and angled it slightly toward Evelyn, not toward Richard, never toward Richard. "Of Carter Holdings Group," he said, and for the first time there was a visible shift in the room that no one could hide. The name landed differently. Not everyone recognized it immediately, but enough did. One of the guests straightened in his seat. Another lowered his glass slowly. The man at the end of the table, the one who had not laughed, exhaled quietly, as if something had just been confirmed. Richard blinked once, then again, processing, rejecting, recalculating. "That is not possible," he said quickly, almost automatically. "I run Carter Holdings." His voice rose slightly, not loud, but enough to reveal the fracture underneath. The man did not argue. He did not correct him directly, he simply adjusted the folder again and spoke with the same steady tone. "You oversee operations," he said, precise, controlled. "But ownership structure was amended 6 months ago." Another pause, just long enough, with majority control transferred to Ms. Evelyn Carter. No one laughed now, no one moved. The room had gone completely still. But this time it was not shock, it was recalibration. People were reprocessing everything they had heard in the last 30 minutes, every joke, every comment, every assumption, and placing it against this new information. Evelyn finally reached for the folder, her fingers steady as she took it, not quickly, not hesitantly, just exactly when she chose to. She glanced down at the top page, then closed it again, not needing to read further. She already knew, of course she did. She lifted her gaze and looked at Richard, not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity, the kind that does not ask for acknowledgement. "You should sit down," she said quietly, her voice even, almost gentle, and for the first time that evening, Richard did not have an immediate response, because in that moment, the story he had been telling no longer held, and he could feel it slipping piece by piece in front of everyone. Richard did not sit down, not immediately. His hand still resting on the back of the chair as if holding on to something solid might help him regain control. His eyes fixed on Evelyn now, Not with authority, not with certainty, but with something tighter, something searching. "What is this?" he asked again, but this time the question was not directed at the man in the suit, it was directed at her, and for the first time that evening, the room understood that the answer would not come from him. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him briefly at the table, at the people who had laughed, at the ones who had stayed quiet, at the ones now avoiding eye contact, and then she spoke, her voice steady, low, carrying just enough to be heard by everyone without needing to rise. "It is exactly what he said," she replied, simple, direct, no explanation layered on top of it, no effort to soften the impact. Richard let out a short breath, shaking his head once, a reflex of disbelief more than denial. "No," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "That does not make sense." He glanced at the others as if someone might confirm his version of reality, but no one spoke, no one moved to support him because the certainty that had filled the room earlier had dissolved, replaced by something far less comfortable, uncertainty. The man in the suit remained still, not interrupting, not adding pressure, just present. Evelyn shifted the folder slightly in her hands, tapping it once against her palm, a small, controlled movement. "6 months ago," she said, her tone unchanged. "The board approved a restructuring." She did not rush the words, did not look down at the documents, she did not need them. "You were traveling," she added, a brief pause. "You said it was not important." Richard's expression tightened, a flicker of memory crossing his face, something he had dismissed, something he had not followed up on, the details aligning too late. "That was a routine review," he said quickly, trying to reassert structure, trying to reduce it to something manageable. Evelyn shook her head once, small, precise. "It was not," she said, and the finality in her voice made it clear that this was not a discussion, it was a correction. One of the guests shifted in their seat, the sound of fabric against wood louder than it should have been. Another reached for their glass but did not drink, just held it. Richard's hand dropped from the chair, his posture changing slightly, less open now, more guarded. "Why would the board do that?" he asked, and this time there was no edge, just confusion, real, unfiltered. Evelyn looked at him for a second longer than before. Not unkind, not cold, just clear. "Because I asked them to," she said, and the simplicity of the answer landed heavier than anything else that had been said. There was no build-up, no dramatic pause, just truth, direct and unavoidable. Richard blinked once, then again. The room seemed to hold its breath, not out of anticipation, but because something fundamental had shifted and no one knew how to respond to it. "You," he repeated, the word almost unfamiliar in his mouth, as if he was testing it, trying to see if it fit into the version of Evelyn he had carried for years. It did not anymore. Evelyn did not elaborate, she did not justify, she did not explain the meetings, the calls, the decisions made quietly while he had been telling himself a different story. She simply stood there, composed, the folder still in her hand, the man beside her waiting without pressure, without urgency, because he already knew the outcome. And around the table, the recalibration continued. People were no longer looking at Evelyn the same way. Not because she had raised her voice or demanded attention, but because she had not, because everything they had believed about her had just been replaced by something far more difficult to ignore. And Richard felt that shift more than anyone, even if he could not yet fully understand it, because for the first time he was no longer the one defining the narrative, and he had no idea how to take it back. Richard took a step back without realizing he had moved, the space between him and Evelyn widening by just a few inches, but enough to be noticed, enough to feel. His eyes searching her face as if something familiar might still be there, something he could recognize and hold on to. But there was nothing new in her expression, nothing dramatic, just the same calm he had seen all night, only now it carried weight. "You asked them?" he repeated, slower this time, trying to reconstruct the sentence into something that made sense, but it did not in the way he needed it to. Evelyn did not nod immediately. She let the silence sit for a moment, not to create tension, but because there was no urgency left in her. Everything that mattered had already been decided long before this dinner. "Yes," she said finally, simple, without emphasis, without explanation, and that word settled into the room like something permanent. One of the guests shifted again, this time pushing their chair back slightly as if needing space. Another cleared their throat but said nothing, because there was nothing safe left to say. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a small, controlled gesture that did not quite hide the fact that his thoughts were no longer aligned. "Since when?" he asked, and this time the question carried something different, not authority, not even frustration, but a quiet realization that he had missed something important, Something he should have seen. Evelyn glanced down briefly at the folder in her hands, then back up at him. Since before the last quarter closed, she said, her tone even. Before the audit. Another pause, just long enough for the implication to settle. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, memory aligning again. Meetings he had skipped, reports he had not reviewed closely, decisions he had delegated without question, because he believed the structure around him was fixed, stable. You never said anything, he replied, and there was something almost defensive in it, as if silence could be used against her. Evelyn tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion but in acknowledgement of the statement. You did not ask, she said, and the simplicity of it left no room to argue, no room to redirect. It was not an accusation, it was a fact, and facts did not require tone. At the table, the man who had not laughed leaned back in his chair now, folding his hands together, watching with a kind of quiet interest that had nothing to do with entertainment anymore. The rest of the guests remained still, their earlier confidence gone. Replaced by a careful distance, Richard looked around the table again. But this time he was not looking for agreement, he was looking for footing, something stable to stand on. But everything had shifted, every expression, every posture, every assumption that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something else, something that did not include him in the same way. The man in the suit spoke again, not interrupting, but continuing the process as if it had always been moving in this direction. There are a few items that require your signature tonight, he said to Evelyn, his tone consistent, professional. The board requested confirmation before tomorrow morning. Evelyn nodded once, not surprised, not rushed. She opened the folder again, scanning the top page briefly, her eyes moving with quiet familiarity across the lines. Richard watched her, and in that moment something else settled in, something colder than confusion, understanding, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to recognize that whatever control he believed he had was no longer where he thought it was. You planned this, he said, not loudly, not accusing, just stating it as it came to him. Evelyn did not look up immediately. She finished reading the line in front of her, then closed the folder again, her fingers resting lightly on the cover. No, she said, her voice calm, I prepared. And that distinction, small as it was, carried more weight than anything else she had said, because planning implied reaction, but preparation implied foresight, intention, patience, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that whatever had just unfolded was not sudden, not accidental, and not reversible. And Richard felt that more than anyone, even if he had no idea what to do with it yet. Richard stood there a second longer than he should have, as if the room had moved forward without him and he was trying to catch up, his eyes flicking between Evelyn and the folder in her hands, then briefly to the man beside her, as though looking for a weak point, something he could challenge, something he could dismantle. But there was nothing obvious, nothing careless. Everything about the moment felt structured, controlled, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Prepared for what? He asked, and this time his voice was quieter, not because he chose it, but because the room no longer belonged to him the way it had just minutes ago. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, not ignoring it, but not rushing to fill it either. She reached into the folder again and turned one page, her movements precise, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. For this, she said finally, simple, direct, and without lifting her eyes from the document. The words did not sound dramatic, they sounded factual, and that made them heavier. Behind Richard, one of the guests shifted in their chair, the faint sound of a glass being set down carefully against the table breaking the silence for a fraction of a second. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because whatever was happening was no longer something they could casually observe. They were part of it now, whether they wanted to be or not. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand moving to his hip, a familiar stance he had used in meetings, in negotiations, in moments where he needed to reassert control, but it did not carry the same weight here, not anymore. You could have told me, he said, and there was something different in it now, not authority, not even accusation, but something closer to realization. Evelyn closed the folder again, her fingers resting lightly on the edge. She looked at him fully this time. Meeting? His gaze without hesitation. I did, she said, her voice calm. Just not in the way you expected. The words landed with a quiet precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Richard frowned slightly, searching his memory again, replaying conversations, dismissals, moments he had brushed past because they did not seem important at the time. And in that process, something else surfaced, something he had overlooked, not once but repeatedly. The man in the suit stepped forward just slightly. Not to interrupt, but to continue the process that had already begun. "If you are ready," he said to Evelyn, holding out a pen, not offering it with ceremony, just presenting it as the next logical step. Evelyn took it without hesitation, the weight of it light in her hand, familiar. She opened the folder again and placed it flat against the edge of the table, not sitting, not leaning, just standing exactly where she had chosen to stand. Richard watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger but in focus, trying to understand the sequence of events as they unfolded in front of him. "What happens after that?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, because he needed to know, needed something concrete to hold on to. Evelyn glanced at the page, then at him, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not emotion, not softness, just acknowledgement. "After this," she said, steady, "everything becomes official." She lowered her gaze. Again, positioning the pen over the line, the room seemed to tighten around that moment, not physically, but in attention. Every person at the table watching now, not out of curiosity, but because they understood that this was the point where everything would change, not just for Evelyn, not just for Richard, but for the way they all understood what had happened here tonight. The man at the end of the table leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the surface, eyes fixed on the document. The others remained still, silent, and Richard felt that silence more than anything else, because it was no longer neutral, it was aligned, not with him, not anymore, and in that realization, something in his posture shifted again, not collapsing but adjusting, as if he was beginning to understand that the position he thought he held had already been replaced, and he had not noticed until now, and that was the part he could not ignore, not anymore. The pen touched the paper, and for a brief second, no one breathed, not because they were told not to, but because something in the room demanded stillness. Evelyn did not hesitate, her hand steady as she signed her name in one smooth motion, not rushed, not careful, just practiced, as if she had signed documents like this many times before, which she had, just never in front of this audience. She lifted the pen slightly, moved to the next line, and signed again, the soft scratch of ink on paper carrying clearly through the silence, each stroke precise, controlled, final, and with every signature, the distance between the version of her they believed and the reality standing in front of them widened. Richard watched the movement of her hand more closely than anything else. Not the man, not the room, just the pen, as if somewhere in that motion he might find a way to interrupt it, to stop it, but he did not move, because something deeper had already settled in, something that told him it was too late for interruption, too late for control. Evelyn finished the last signature and closed the folder without ceremony. No dramatic pause, no look around the room, just a simple, deliberate action that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. She handed the folder back to the man, who accepted it with a slight nod, flipping it closed and securing it under his arm. "Thank you," he said quietly, his tone unchanged, professional, respectful, as if this had gone exactly as expected, because for him it had. He stepped back half a pace, giving her space again, not stepping away completely, just enough to signal that his role in this moment was nearly finished. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but in the silence it carried. He looked at Evelyn again, really looked at her this time, not as the version he had described minutes earlier, not as the person he had dismissed in front of everyone, but as someone he clearly did not understand anymore. "So that is it?" he asked, and the question was not sharp, not defensive, just uncertain. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, the movement controlled, composed. "For tonight," she said, and there was no emphasis, no hidden meaning layered in her tone, just a boundary, clear and defined. One of the guests shifted in their chair, finally breaking the stillness. Another reached for their glass again, this time actually taking a sip, as if trying to return to something normal. But nothing felt normal anymore, not the room, not the conversation, not the way they looked at each other. Richard glanced around the table once more, but this time there was no expectation in it, no search for validation, just a quiet recognition that the dynamic had changed, completely, irreversibly. The man at the end of the table gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something he had suspected earlier, something that now made sense. The others avoided eye contact with Richard, not out of judgment but out of discomfort, because they had participated, even if only through silence, and now they did not know where to place themselves in this new version of events. Evelyn stepped back from the table, not retreating, just repositioning, her hands resting loosely at her sides again, her posture unchanged, her expression the same calm that had been there from the beginning, but now it carried context, now it meant something different. "We should finish dinner," she said quietly, and the statement was not a suggestion, not a question, just a continuation, as if the evening had not been disrupted, as if everything that had just happened was simply part of the same controlled sequence she had been following all along. The words landed in the room with a strange effect, not dismissive, not indifferent, but stabilizing, giving the other something to hold on to, something familiar. One of the guests nodded slowly. Another adjusted their seat, small movements returning, cautious, measured. Richard did not sit immediately. He stood there for another second, then two, before finally lowering himself back into his chair. The motion slower than usual, more deliberate, as if he was aware now of every movement he made, every shift in posture. Evelyn took her seat as well, smoothly, without hesitation, reaching for her glass and taking a small sip of water, the sound of the glass touching the table again soft but clear. And just like that, the dinner resumed, not the same, never the same, but moving forward, because there was no going back, not for Richard, not for anyone at that table, and certainly not for Evelyn, who had already moved past this moment long before it ever began. The conversation resumed, but it did not return to what it had been. It moved carefully now, each word measured, each laugh softer, shorter, as if everyone at the table had suddenly become aware of the weight their voices carried. Forks touched plates, glasses lifted and set down, but the rhythm was different, slower, more deliberate. Richard sat with his hands resting on the edge of the table, his posture controlled, but no longer relaxed, his eyes drifting occasionally toward Evelyn, then away again, as if he was still adjusting to the new alignment of everything around him. He tried once to speak, to pick up a thread from earlier, something about a recent deal, but the words did not land the same way. They did not carry the authority they had before, and he seemed to realize it mid-sentence, letting it fade without finishing. Evelyn, on the other hand, moved through the evening with the same calm consistency she had maintained from the beginning. She listened when someone spoke to her, responded when appropriate, her tone even, her presence steady, nothing exaggerated, nothing forced, and that, more than anything, unsettled the room, because it made it clear that this moment, this shift, was not new to her. It had simply become visible to everyone else. One of the guests eventually cleared his throat and spoke directly to her, carefully, respectfully. "I did not realize you were involved at that level," he said, choosing his words with precision. Evelyn looked at him briefly, then nodded once. "There are many things people do not realize," she replied, her voice quiet, but not dismissive, just factual. The man nodded in return, accepting the answer without pushing further, because the room had already learned that there was more beneath the surface than any of them had understood. Richard shifted in his chair again, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table before stilling, a small, unconscious movement. He glanced toward the door where the man had entered earlier, now closed again, the presence gone but not forgotten, and in that glance something else settled in, a recognition that the interruption had not been an intrusion, it had been a transition, and he had not been the one in control of it. Dinner continued, but the structure had changed. Conversations no longer orbited around Richard, they moved more freely now, sometimes toward Evelyn, sometimes away from both of them, but never returning to the dynamic that had existed before. And that absence was more noticeable than any argument could have been. Plates were cleared, drinks refilled, time passed, but the underlying awareness remained steady, unspoken. As the evening began to wind down, chairs shifted back, jackets were collected, polite goodbyes exchanged, but even those felt different, more intentional, more aware. One by one, the guests approached Evelyn, not dramatically, not all at once, but individually, offering brief acknowledgments, small nods, quiet words that carried more weight than their volume suggested. She accepted each one the same way, calmly, without emphasis, without lingering. Richard stood nearby, watching, not interrupting, not inserting himself, just observing, because there was nothing left for him to manage in that moment, and he knew it, even if he had not yet fully processed how it had happened. Eventually, the last guest stepped out, the door closing behind them with a soft, final sound, and for the first time since the evening began, the house was quiet again, not tense, not heavy, just quiet. Evelyn moved back into the dining room, collecting her glass, setting it in the sink with a soft clink, her movements efficient, unhurried, as if this were any other night. Richard remained where he was for a moment, then followed, stopping a few feet behind her, the distance noticeable, intentional or not. "Evelyn," he said, her name no longer casual, no longer part of a performance, just a statement. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. "Yes," she replied, her tone unchanged. He paused, searching for something to say that would fit into this new structure, something that would restore balance, but nothing came easily. Not anymore, I did not know, he said finally, and there was no defense in it, no accusation, just truth. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. I know, she said, and the simplicity of it closed the space between what had been and what was, not with conflict, not with resolution, but with clarity. She turned back to the sink, rinsing the glass, placing it carefully on the rack, and in that quiet, controlled movement, it became clear that whatever had shifted tonight was not temporary, not something that would be undone by conversation or explanation. It was already complete, already in place, and Richard stood there, understanding just enough to realize that the version of the story he had believed in no longer existed, and that the silence Evelyn had held all evening had never been empty, it had been waiting.